Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, we're joined by my dear friend Lazar Nikolov, who is a developer advocate, content creator, and really performance maestro over at Sentry. In our discussion, we go really deep on performance, monitoring, events, tracing, and more, both in Sentry and outside. We talk a lot about core web vitals and how you can really get the most out of core web vitals, including optimizing for cumulative layout shift, that is CLS, and more. Our discussion is pretty deep, and I hope you enjoy it. In some portions, my audio seems a little bit too reverby and echoey. This is the first season, and there may be some production hiccups, and so I apologize for that. Going forward, we're going to try and do better there. Still, we've done our best to make the words clear and intelligible, so we hope you enjoy. And before we get started, it's worth mentioning that all of this has a cost, but I want to offer it to you at no cost. And to help us do that, we have sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please reach out on X. That's where I'm most active. And let's begin this episode by thanking today's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by crabnebula.dev. Crab Nebula makes not only building applications using Tauri as a Tauri partner much simpler, but also streamlines application delivery with Crab Nebula Cloud. Literally with Git push, your GitHub repo can instantly release and deploy applications worldwide with minimal effort. To get started, check it out at crabnebula.dev. All the links you need are in the show notes. And now for my discussion with Lazar Nikolov. Lazar, absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tejas.
So good to see you and to hear from you. Look, we've been planning this for such a long time. There's been reschedules, there's been conferences in between, but I'm glad we can sit down and actually make the time to chat.
Yeah, too much rescheduling, if you ask me.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I own partially the responsibility for that. But in any case, I'm glad. Maybe we can start with an introduction to yourself. I obviously will probably record one ahead of time and we'll air it just before the episode. But I want to give you the chance in your own words to sort of introduce yourself and what you're up to, what you're about. And then we can dig into monitoring and the details there.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Lazar Nikolov, and I'm a DevRel at Sentry. And currently, I'm focused on anything web performance, whether that's front end or back end. I'm interested in all of that.
That's so cool. DevRel at Sentry and web performance front end and back end. So Sentry, no exception, is a monitoring tool. Can we maybe define that just to start the discussion? Monitoring, what is it? You mentioned it applies to the front end, the back end, etc. But I have to believe monitoring is not just about finding out when something crashes, when errors happen. There's also performance monitoring. There's things like P99 monitoring, probably core web vitals monitoring. Could you break that down for us sort of in a broad way, and then we can go deeper?
Yeah. So, for example, I like to say that monitoring is just a continuous reporting on, and alerting, not just reporting and alerting on important events that are happening within your software, whether it's like errors or, a certain performance threshold, gets crossed, or as you mentioned, core web vitals, latency, yeah, any type of important event that happens on production in your app.
Interesting. And Sentry allows what are some of the metrics that Sentry allows you to monitor? I mean, you did mention core web vitals, P99 latency. Is it just all of them? Are there specific ones that Sentry is better at or not better at?
I would say, yeah, all of them. We also monitor, for example, DB queries when you have like slow or slower DB queries, etc. There's core web vitals. We monitor navigation and page load events, and you get a nice trace of everything that's going on during the page load event, so you can identify any performance bottlenecks.
So
That means also render blocking resources.
Wow, that is really everything. So it's entirely possible to instrument and monitor the full end-to-end life cycle of user experience.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
How does one go about accomplishing, I mean, not from a user perspective, but from an implementer perspective, right? How does one think at that level? Look, I've been a senior engineer. I've been multiple different kinds of engineers over my career. And usually I was like focused on one part of the stack, right? Either front end, back end, doing some Terraform and cloud formation, DevOpsy type stuff, but specialized. But what it sounds like is if you can monitor literally everything, it's quite a general, but also it has to be a specialized approach because there's certain domain specific concerns in backend that you would have to map to whatever monitoring system is exposed. So, I mean, how does that work? Are there multiple teams that are responsible for like the overall SDK that touch the SD? I'll let you speak.
Yeah. So we do take these things in account, the ones that you mentioned, like you were focused on a specific stack and not necessarily have the have responsibilities to work everywhere on every part of the system. And that's why, for example, we built all these SDKs specifically for language and specifically for a framework, right? So we have Next.js Remix. There's also like Laravel for backend. The Next.js one also has a backend part to it. So the way that, for example, we're doing performance monitoring is by trying to not trying, but like succeedingly, succeedingly automatically instrumenting all the important bits of your app and your operation flows. So, for example, you get the data without necessarily needing to explicitly say, I want to monitor this part, right? So, for example, when you initialize the Sentry SDK, you're going to get automatic instrumentation throughout the whole, as long as you have SDKs initialized. If your front end has an SDK initialized and your backend has an initialized, you're actually going to connect the front end with the backend, and it's going to be one single trace.
What? You said something so interesting. So you said not only do you offer unified experiences, or rather distinct experiences per portion of the stack, so for front end or back end, etc. But you also mentioned per framework, so it gets more granular. And you said these various adaptations of your monitoring system for Next.js or Remix or whatever is somehow aware of the important bits and it knows exactly what to measure. And I'm assuming so with Next.js, it would probably measure like get server side props performance or something like this. How does it know that? Is there like a Next.js team sitting and manually writing these things per framework adapter for Sentry? Or that's just super interesting to me. What the criteria for important bits is.
That is exactly what's happening. So we got multiple teams working on all of the SDKs that we currently support. So the idea is to tap into the SDK itself, tap into the lifecycle events and like event handlers that are known and exposed by the framework itself, by the tool itself, and then set up all of the necessary instrumentation logic on the like on framework level. So whatever your app is, it doesn't matter because we're in a way instrumenting the framework. So when your app lives on top of the framework, anything that your app does gets also pulled in.
That's so cool because frameworks are, they come with opinions, they come with conventions, so this makes it somewhat easy to just train people, go like, look, in Next.js these are the conventions and those are the things to measure. Are those weighted, meaning is one metric from a typical Next.js site somehow more important than another, and if yes, how is that determined?
No, they're not. I mean, for example, if we're pulling Core Web Vitals, we're just pulling Core Web Vitals, right? Anything that the either the browser or the framework reports to the Sentry SDK that gets sent to the Sentry instance. So there is
Right.
no importance in terms of performance data between two frameworks. It's just performance data. Yeah.
I think that's so cool. So I can instrument multiple frameworks, front end or back end, and I could even have some application where my front end is jQuery and my back end is PHP or Rails, and it doesn't like it just transcends languages and frameworks to the same reporting backend. Wow, that's incredible. I see the power here. Now, this obviously helps this helps developers identify issues ahead of time. By ahead of time, I mean before something blows up. If something blows up for someone else, then before the user reporting the issue, ideally Sentry would report the issue. There's some type of alerting built in. We can probably talk about the details of alerting later, but since it helps find issues ahead of time before users report stuff, How close or far is this in terms of like metaphor to like TypeScript versus JavaScript? Because TypeScript is similar, right? It maybe adds a bit of complexity to JavaScript, but ultimately it helps you catch stuff that can go wrong before stuff actually does go wrong.
Yeah, in a way. For example, looking at a really high level point of view, TypeScript versus JavaScript, as opposed to like Sentry focuses on the mainly post release phase of your app, right? So that's when after you make a release. But we also recently launched Spotlight, which is bringing all that goodies into dev time. So while developing the app, and you have a, for example, you have an issue in your backend, or maybe what personally I have experienced is that, well, working on, for example, on Next.js apps or Astro websites where my endpoints use other third-party services and there's an error happening, it's hard to see that, right? It's hard to see. It's uh, setting up a debugging, flow in your IDE is sometimes tricky. But yeah, with Spotlight, you actually get a full trace and to what exactly is going on in the backend as well. But yeah, in terms of TypeScript versus JavaScript and that analogy, by ahead of time, we mean that Sentry is going to report anything or like anything wrong that's happening in your app when the first user experiences it, right? So you get notified immediately of it. And we also send you all sorts of data like hardware info, software info, what is the type of device, the browser, the operating system, RAM, memory, like the stack trace, the exact file and line of code where that happens, and you just get bombarded with info. So our goal is to have all the developers in and out of Sentry in 5 minutes and on their way to fix the problem before the majority of the users experience it, right? So that's the before your users. So you don't really wait for a benevolent user to take its time to write you an email saying, what actually they were doing and what happened and
Yeah.
how it looked like. Yeah.
Yeah, I have so much to say, but I have some confessions. So I've been using Sentry in production since 2016. I want to say so. That's 8 years now. I confess I didn't use it very well, but it honestly, my first time using Sentry was a godsend because I was a freelance web developer before when I was younger, and I'd build things for clients and they'd break. Of course, all software breaks at some point. I literally just now had to restart Mac OS because it wouldn't accept my microphone, right? But when stuff broke, I would have to ask them, hey, what browser, what OS, what. So you just mentioned, Sentry just bombards the developer with all this information ahead of time. I've firsthand witnessed it save a lot of my time just in doing that. I did not use Sentry well because I recognized in a multi-tenant application this was giving me some type of backdoor visibility into what users were doing that I did not want. But once it was there, I was like, oh wait, I can learn about, I get telemetry. So that's almost security risk. I'm curious if that's something that happens to more users, if that's in DevRel, if that's a thing that the conversation you have to keep having.
Yeah, I mean, people keep asking about, what is the privacy of their apps users, but we have implemented like PII scrubbing on multiple
Can we, sorry to
points.
interrupt you, we probably should identify PII for listeners who may not be familiar with the
Oh yeah,
acronym.
yeah. PII is just like personal information, like emails, names, any basically any type of information that can help identify a person, right? That
Personally identifiable information. Got
Yeah,
it.
personally identifiable information. Yeah. So we implement PII scrubbing on multiple touch points. So for example, we scrub part of the not part like we scrub PII on SDK level. When we send the data that Sentry captures, we send it to a thing called Relay. Relay also does some PII scrubbing, and there's also like PII scrubbing in the backend as well. So yeah,
Wow.
we care about
That's
these things. And yeah, PII scrubbing is definitely something that we've been invested in. a lot.
That is so good. I'm curious for the initial step of identifying PII at the SDK level that you mentioned. I have to ask, and feel free to not answer. I assume everything's open source, so we can talk about it. How? How do you? Is it just if you see an object with a predictable key like email, then it's just a big if else, like if key equals email, obfuscate. If not, let it go. Is it like that at the SDK level, or is there more nuanced logic?
Yeah. So for example, PII can usually be found in either tags or event contexts. In the context is explicit, right? So if I set a value, because the context is like a key value
Yeah.
which is attached to every event. If I set the
But by
user
by key
email
value,
there,
sorry to interrupt. By key value, you mean a big JavaScript object.
yeah,
Okay.
context is like a big JavaScript object that gets attached to every event that gets sent to Sentry. If I explicitly set the user's email to a specific event, then it's gonna be there. So contexts and PII, it's on me where I explicitly set. But the things that we capture automatically, for example, session replay, basically all text is just stars. So not even the layout and any like any text and pictures are basically obfuscated from you when you're going to replay the replay.
That's so cool. Okay, so if I include things, if I include PII in my Sentry events, it's on me basically to obfuscate that.
Yeah, we
Okay.
cannot take that away from you. For example, if you want to capture those types of informations explicitly, we can't just obfuscate you and say like, no, you're not allowed to do that,
Mm,
right? So if you're explicitly setting these information, you're gonna get it, right? So
yeah,
you're gonna send them to Sentry. But like everything that happens automatically gets scrubbed away.
that's so good to know. I want to talk about, you mentioned Sentry before Spotlight. I do want to dive into Spotlight. That sounds really cool. Dev time reporting and monitoring. But with Sentry and its post release, meaning its production level monitoring, when you receive errors and stack traces, usually those are minified, right? And uglified, so to speak. And
Yeah,
variable names, they go from being something meaningful like count to the letter A. And we often use source maps to unfurl them. Does Sentry do that? Can I look at my unminified code and find the error on the right line, or does it show me just like minified stuff?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the preferred way is, of course, to uglify, minify, obfuscate the hell out of your JavaScript and push that to production. So it's like easier to load, right? It's smaller file. But then, for example, when you're pushing a release, either from your CLI or from CI/CD pipelines, the SDK itself can and does generate all the sitemaps and upload them in your Sentry instance. So you have to you have to set up the API key of your Sentry account in order to do that. So you have access to upload, bundles and resources under your account. But yeah, that is exactly what's happening. So when you get an error, you actually Sentry will unobfuscate and unminify part of the code, part of the stack trace that is reported along with the error.
That's incredible. So I mean, and I'm assuming Sentry also has session. You mentioned Sentry has a bunch of things, so I think it's within the realm of reason to assume there's also session replay. So not only do I see the line of code, I can look at like the user session where the error happened, and I 5 minutes in, 5 minutes out. I believe that's how you put it.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah. I mean, session replay is pretty cool because you don't also get the session replay is DOM recording, right? It's not like screen recording. It's not an MP4. It's DOM recording, and you get to scrub through the user using your app. But what's cool about it is that we also capture the console. We also capture the network, all the network requests that go in and out. There's like a memory footprint as well. So like it's like you literally with the user as the error happens, and you get their laptop and you open inspect element and you see for yourself what actually happened there.
incredible, incredible. This question may be a little bit, I don't know, maybe little bit controversial. Feel free to not answer, but I'm curious. Have you heard of replay.io?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
that's
and
like
how
one
and
of
how
the
that
competitors, I guess. Yeah,
well, is it though? Because like Sentry does a lot of stuff, a lot, and Replay has this one. So maybe it competes on like one or two features, right?
yeah,
How do you feel about that? Because it's close to session replay, but it's not exactly session replay. Because what they're doing is they're capturing the entire event loop of the browser and replaying all the JavaScript events, which enables some extra stuff to session replay. But some would say, and I'm not saying any stance of mine on this, and if you don't want to, that's fine. But I'm just curious from a technical perspective. What it does enable is like you can console.log after the fact. So it's like an interactive session replay almost. Yeah, could you maybe speak to that? Does Sentry plan to add stuff like that? Is it even possible without like implementing your own sniffer of browser events? I'd be curious to hear your take on that.
yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I haven't personally played with Replay.io before. That sounds like a cool feature, if you ask me. But yeah, but if we plan on achieving some of that features and functionalities, I honestly can't tell you. I think that's
Yeah,
Millen or David that
yeah.
can speak to that.
I love Millen. We should get him on the show at some point. Awesome. Let's talk about Spotlight. So Sentry, I've only used Sentry to help me identify, monitor things in production, as you mentioned. But this is the first time in my life I hear that I can do this at dev time. The question is how? Like, would the URLs just be like localhost 3000 with the same data? How does it connect to a backend that is in the cloud? So oftentimes we develop cross environments. We shouldn't. I agree. Everybody should have their local Docker and everything's perfect. But I mean, we live in a world of fast moving startups and compromises. And if we don't admit that, we're kind of just lying to ourselves, right? So oftentimes what I've seen in the wild is people will be building a front end with Next.js maybe, and they're running that on localhost 3000 because the local development experience of Next.js is pretty good. However, the same can't be said for a lot of backend systems. And ideally, again, everything's Docker Compose and so on, but oftentimes they're developing against some deployed staging in the cloud, or even worse, some deployed production in the cloud. Does Sentry Spotlight, first of all, I'd love just an intro and some more details there, but after we're done with that, I'm curious how Sentry Spotlight would connect my local host to the production backend and maybe differentiate them in like test cases versus production cases.
Yeah, so I don't have like too much technical understanding of like how Spotlight works, but we built it initially for Astro. So when Astro came out with the like the dev toolbar, I think we were the first plugin to be supported on the dev toolbar. And what happens is Spotlight, I think, will boot up either a version of Sentry server locally, and there was this thing called Sidecar. I should read more about this before going to shows.
That's
But yeah,
okay.
basically what Spotlight does is it opens a little window inside of your application, and it gives you an overview of all the errors that are happening as further away as it can trace. So, for example, if your local host's backend is enabled by the SDK, you're going to get that event into Spotlight. It also builds a trace for you. So, for example, as like I don't know, you hit refresh, and let's say it's an SPA app, you see all the requests that are coming, from the client or
Right.
from the front end to the back end. But then, if your backend is tracing enabled, you can like expand on those requests and see how the backend did, for example, the database requests before it returned the result back to the front end. So that all happens locally because all of the SDKs know how to talk to Spotlight, and you
Correct.
get all that info during dev time.
Wow. Wow. I mean, okay, but what if the back, does this even work then with a foreign backend, so not a local backend? I guess it should, right? Because if it's instrumented and if monitoring is enabled, then the foreign backend will just say, hey, this request came from localhost. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
I
Like
see.
if for example the backend supports the Sentry trace header,
Yeah,
which is a way to distribute the trace, I believe it's going to. I haven't tested it, so don't get
yeah,
my
for
word for
sure.
it, but I believe it's going to.
That's okay. So, can we? I have a really naive question, and I think part of the reason people, at least I anticipate people will listen to this, is because I ask the questions that maybe some people are afraid to ask for fear of looking like beginners. I have no problem with looking like a beginner. How do you persist a tracing header inside of a database transaction? So I mean, if everything's speaking HTTP, it's cool. We just add a header, persist the header through the HTTP stream. But at some point, you're speaking not HTTP, but like PSQL protocol, right? PG protocol
Yeah.
in case of a Postgres database. I don't know if that supports the same headers as HTTP requests. So how then do you go from like this client did a request to slash API slash buy, and it spoke to all of these intermediary APIs, and in the database that translated into a select, then update, then etc. etc.
So I'm not sure on database level how that would look like, but basically in order to basically move the trace from one service to another, you just need to transfer a string, right? So for example, the trace header is by standard it's like a three value string. It has
Hmm.
the trace ID dash the parent span ID. What is the like the last span that actually triggered
Yeah,
that request that made the app move from one service to another? And then there's the value of whether the trace is sampled or not. But we can all actually omit that. So these are the two values that are important. So as long as you can move and persist that string, you can actually continue the trace. Whether that's like a database, you can store it as a string, right? There can also be like instances of cron jobs picking up something like some operation that happened, I don't know, 24 hours ago or like last week, maybe. It is possible because you're moving a string, and when the cron job, for example, contributes spans and transactions to that trace, the trace is the trace does exist. So it's just going to be applied to it, right?
that's so cool. So you can after the fact look at which traces were affected by this cron job and which weren't, and you can really get a detailed view there. That is so cool. I didn't even think about that. I didn't think about the time domain that sporadically. So that's quite interesting. Okay, so back to monitoring. Sentry does monitoring, but again, a naive question. I apologize if this is too naive. I've worked with a number of startups that have had the conversation around monitoring. What should we do? Who should we choose? Et cetera, et cetera. Sentry has always been an option. Frankly, Sentry has always been my go-to, just because it was the first one I used in a serious production workload, and I felt almost no reason to move away. And also like the login experiences of other providers that I'm about to name in Europe is particularly difficult. I often try to log into the US one, and then it tells me my user doesn't exist, and then I find, oh, there's a tiny little drop down somewhere for EU, and then I have to go. Yeah. Anyway, without dogging too much on the competition, there's others. There's part of the conversation that often comes up: New Relic, Datadog, Post Hog, the newest one, which almost sounds like a command for me to post a picture of a pig. How is Sentry different? Is it different? I'm assuming it is. It's better. You're about to tell me. I'm curious how, and if not, how Sentry wants to be different in the future.
I like to think that Sentry differs from the others, even on like a philosophical level. So, for
Wow.
example, others usually started, with infra. That means gathering data from virtual machines, containers, servers, logs, etc. And aside from collecting app data, and all of that gets sent to a central place. So you, as a developer, need to invest some time either building dashboards or like just like making sense of all that data, because not everything, especially on like network level and infrastructure level, is does matter to you, right? But Sentry is the opposite of that. So we don't even have logs in our app. We don't support just like sending logs as messages. We started in Python and JavaScript, for developers, and that has always been our focus. And starting from Python and JavaScript, and we just expanded on everything else. So yeah, some of the others have even moved on to serve other audiences like security engineers or testers, etc. But yeah, we our main persona has been the developer, and and we capture and provide the developer with what matters to the developer, not the infrastructure or platform folks or other
Hmm.
roles in the industry.
Is it fair to say specifically the probably not? I'm already like parsing what I'm about to say is wrong, but I want you to tell me it's wrong. Is it fair to say it's geared towards the either front end UI or application developer? Because ultimately, even the infrastructure engineers are developers; they're engineers, right? And so to say it's the developer over the infra people is not entirely accurate. So is it a specific kind of developer, and then is that specific kind of developer a UI or application developer?
Yeah, so we like to say that, for example, like the whole thing is connected, right? Whether we are like front end or back end issues show up on the front end, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I can say that we might have more focus on the front end devs just because we have like all the SDKs for specific frameworks, and we know in JavaScript how saturated the market is with
Yeah.
frameworks and libraries and tools. We like to have an SDK for each of them, and since like errors and traces are at the core of the whole functionality of Sentry, it doesn't really matter, like where the error happens, it's just going to be reported.
Yeah.
And since everything is connected, for example, backend errors that are triggered by the front end can be seen in session replays because
Mm,
all of the three separate concepts actually contribute to one single trace.
right.
Yeah,
Right. So it is, however, it sounds like it's still more geared to like frontline product engineers, like people who are building the product and not the infrastructure behind the scenes. And
we can
and I,
see
I
that.
want
Yeah.
to make this distinction. I want to make it really clear because so I worked at Spotify for a little while, and so Spotify is actually kind of cool in that there is no, like you mentioned, it's all connected. So there's no like front end engineer, back end. It's just you're a software engineer. Good luck, which I think is quite cool. And we were dealing with migrating to a new internal developer portal, a place where, I mean, Spotify is a company of like 4,500 employees back when I was there, and hundreds of microservices, and there was no real way to like monitor each service and so on. Like even Sentry, I don't know, maybe it wasn't sufficient or something, but like there was no centralized like service catalog, and so we were deploying one of these things internally. It's called Backstage. It's open source, and I have, by the way, no financial relationship to any of that, or even to Sentry at this point in time. I just want to make that really clear. But the we were deploying this thing, and we really needed to monitor it. And so what they had us do was months and months of research on open telemetry and capturing and instrumenting various things for traces, and then feeding that data into Grafana for a big dashboard. The problem is we had a number of engineers without the relevant experience. I was one of them, frankly. I was not so well versed in Grafana at the time. And so what I'm hearing from you is Sentry's claim to fame, so to speak, is let's just not have people have to deal with all of that and just give them a bunch of SDKs and APIs to say, hey, add this DSN somewhere, add an API key, and then all the dashboarding and tracking is just automatically done. How close or far from reality is what I just said?
No, that's pretty much spot on. Yeah, so you use Sentry, and all of those things are being automatically done for you. There's always like escape catches based on like on framework level. So if you want to do something custom, you're always welcome to do so. We also have an OTel integration. So if you want to move to Sentry, and but you already have an instrumentation done with OTel, you can just use the OTel collector and send data to Sentry. You can parse that.
Okay, so then you can just get like a front end for free for all of your metrics, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And the value that Sentry will give you, even though you're, for example, pulling OTel data and sending that to Sentry, is alerting, sending you emails or Slack messages or Discord, anywhere that you can be found.
Yeah.
And like the actual backend intelligence, right?
Yeah.
We're parsing the data. We're being smart about it. If you have a performance issue, we're gonna send you an email about it
Yeah.
smartly. Like if you have an uncompressed asset, we'll tell you about it. If you have a slow DB query, we'll tell you about it. So Sentry has its own instrumentator. You can also use OTel as an instrumentator and send data back to Sentry. But there's the value, right? The
Yeah.
value is Sentry looking at the data, trying to understand the data that you're sending to Sentry, and then providing you with all the actionable stuff that you can actually
Yeah.
do in the code base.
Awesome. That's so good. And I'm glad you mentioned Sentry, like collecting the data and running intelligence on the data, because I want to get at one thing that I think is practical as a takeaway for a lot of the listeners is the most common pitfalls and performance problems you observe. And I this question may have no basis, but I have to assume if Sentry is ingesting tons and tons of data, probably petabytes per day or something. I mean, not to overestimate the user base, but as a happy user myself, I see Kent Dodds talking about Sentry. Everybody's talking about Sentry, and it seems to be widely used. In fact, clients of mine use Sentry in production. Crab Nebula, a sponsor of the podcast, uses Sentry in production. And so lots of users, and the events are, I don't use like belittling language, but events are cheap. They're just like JSON, they're text, right? So there can be lots of them. And so what I'm getting at is Sentry probably receives billions and billions of events of usually errors. So does Sentry have like a big, broad overview of all the world's collective performance issues? And if yes, then for the listeners, I think this would be interesting. What are they? What are the most common issues that keep coming up that maybe we can talk about how to avoid?
Yeah. So, for example, theoretically, you're sending data if you're not self-hosting. You're sending data to Sentry, right? So the performance data and everything of your app sits on Sentry servers. The data is there. I personally haven't tried to like access it and make sense of anything, but I know that we're exploring the ways and possibilities to provide that like any performance insights that we keep in in our database in our database to the users. I'm not sure, like the functionality is not there. I'm not sure when we're going to be able to do that, but I know that we're looking into just like resurfacing that back to the world, or like in through reports, or I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So there isn't something like that yet, but what I'm hearing is that it may be somewhere on the horizon. Yeah, I think that would be so valuable in shifting the web towards healthier practices. Like there's this survey, it's called Web Almanac or something, where they,
Oh yeah,
or even the state of JS, right? They show you things that make you go, oh, I should maybe do this differently. Therefore, I create better experiences on the web. And given the volume of data that Sentry receives, I feel like this has to happen at some point. Sort of like your 2024 Unwrapped, where it's like here's your biggest issues, but on a global scale.
totally. There is an experiment, Sentry.live. It's basically the world map, and there's like a little light every time an error
What?
happens, and it's
That is
crazy.
so cool. That is so cool. Okay, and can I then see what the error is? Can I drill down into like
Not yet, not yet, but we're trying to just like make something fun out of it. Like what are the most common, like paint the errors and lights based on the language or the
yeah.
SDK. For example, I don't know, JS can be yellow lights, and I don't know, C sharp can be blue lights, and we'll see if there are more yellow lights or blue lights in this
That is
world.
so cool. That is so Sentry.live. I will put that in the show notes and check it out
Yeah.
after this episode.
Right now, yeah, right now it's just this, hacked together thingy that's it's not responsive or anything like that. It's just fun to look at. And yeah, but we would like to make more sense out of it and like make build something fun with the
Yeah.
data.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not the job of DevRel, I don't know what is. You know, let's talk about a little bit about the interesting portions of Sentry. So I as mentioned, I've used Sentry quite a bit, and I see with events. Events, again, being like, hey, this thing that should be fast is somewhat slower than it is, or this exception happened. And as an aside, what I really like about Sentry is you can say, only tell me about this if it happens more than like n times for more than n users, which I think is really cool. But anyway, I see some events and it tells me there's a parent, and then there's this event, and then there's like n children, like 3 children. What does that mean? What are children? So for me as a developer, I've seen the events, and I know, okay, the event, something went wrong, something took long. I fix it, but I've never really had the time to look deep into this children thing. So if you could elaborate on that, I'd be interested.
Yeah. So remember when we talk about how the trace is like at the core of everything?
Yeah.
That is like a little mini map that shows you where you are, where that event or crash is in the trace. So, for example, the parent would be the trace parent, the event that triggered the trace, and the children are any other events or operations that preceded the error. So you know where in the whole operation flow the error happened.
So
That
is the
that's
top
little.
is okay? So is the topmost thing then the client device, the browser, and then the bottommost thing is the database, typically in a classic like web application?
Yeah, usually the topmost would make sense to be any client facing because that's the initiator, right?
Yeah,
A user clicked on a button and it triggered this whole operation flow, right? And somewhere in the whole operation flow, an error happened, maybe in the middle. That's the thing that you're referring to is that little mini map to tell you where you are in the flow.
that's so cool. So I can see at a glance how close to my database or to my user something went wrong. That
Yeah,
is
and for example, at the
absolutely
time
nuts.
where the error happened, what are the other operations that happened after that? So if the error, resulted in a faulty data, what are the other operations that ingested that data? So you can also look into those. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Man, I that's so cool. I've always used Sentry so far in such a one-dimensional way. I'm realizing now. I appreciate this is like a free crash course. I'm so excited. And then the second question I had was around the Apdex. I've never seen this term outside of Sentry, and maybe that's just because I haven't looked enough. I've heard this also called the misery meter as a way of measuring user pain. I've never seen it before, and I'm sure our listeners may or may not have. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is it? How's it calculated? And how does Sentry use it?
Yeah. So the Apdex is a vague metric. It's been around, since I think like the beginning, maybe, but
The beginning of what?
the beginning of Century at least. It's
Okay.
not ours. We didn't invent it. It's like a thing. It's like an open standard that lets you define how you're going to report, how you're going to measure user satisfaction. And that can start from like how long the server took to get the response back and how long the user looked at spinning wheels, all the way to measuring food quality or how long the beer gets poured, So it's just like it's a vague metric to measure user satisfaction. So yeah, it's not connected in any way. For example, with Core Web Vitals, I think it's a duration based index. I think Apdex stands for Application Performance Index, and
Interesting.
but yeah, it's like platform agnostic. It's it's pretty vague. It gives you the overall user satisfaction, but that doesn't really mean anything to you. It's there if you want to see it. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Okay. So I mean, I've seen it in Sentry, and this is why I ask because I don't know what to do with it. But it turns out there may be nothing I can do with it.
yeah, it's just an
Okay.
index. Yeah, just like an overall vague index. How satisfied are your users based on this Apdex standard? It's like apdex.org, I think,
Okay.
where it's defined,
That's
something like that.
you
Yeah.
know, I'm so thankful we're doing this because I always thought this was a me problem. I'm just finding out no, it's just not a very useful figure. You did a talk, you do a number of talks as a DevRel professional. I appreciate all of them. I've watched some of them in preparing for this. and you do talks about performance. We've talked so far about events and errors with Sentry. We've talked about the tracing and so on. Let's talk about performance a little bit, specifically around Core Web Vitals. You do a bunch of talks about this, and you create some content here. Could you maybe say a couple of sentences about Core Web Vitals, sort of a primer on it for those who aren't familiar? And then let's dig into some of the specific ones that I've seen you be somewhat passionate about.
Yeah, so we're doing this thing. It's pretty new. For example, since like second half of last year, where we are revamping how or like rethinking how developers use Sentry. So we're coming up with these modules that are specific to certain things. For example, we have a Web Vitals module, right? It's like a little landing page, like a little dashboard where you click on it, you select your project, and you're presented with all the Web Vitals scores in your, throughout your pages in your app. And then there's for example, a table of all of the pages that report Web Vitals, so you can see which ones, deserve some of your attention. So yeah, we're doing this new thing around the Web Vitals, so you can like more easily debug and make sure that your vitals are vital, that your
Can we can
score
we
is good.
can we talk a little bit about what the vitals are, just for including everybody?
Yeah,
So yeah, let's do that.
yeah. So for example, we got LSP, right, the largest contentful paint. We'd like to think that that is when pretty much the like the page has been loaded. That like that is the last, not the last, but the largest content piece, which is usually an image, right?
Yeah.
Gets rendered, so that means the user can like start consuming the content and whatever's on the website. Then we're working on a support for INP as well. What else is there?
INP
CLS.
INP is new, right? And what is INP? Do we remember what it stands for? I forget.
Yeah, it's interaction to next paint. It's basically
Wow,
how long it takes for the browser to handle repaints upon a user interaction, right? So I've
that's
seen this happen, and it's like frustrating when you click on for example, when you click on an accordion, and it takes like a second for the accordion
that's
to
the
expand.
worst, the
It is the worst.
worst.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that is INP.
so it's like also, for example, navigation, right? Like if it's more client side or soft navigation, I click on a link to go somewhere and it hangs or it lags.
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting. Okay,
for
INP,
SPAs especially, for yeah.
that's so interesting. I haven't looked into, is INP new?
Yeah, it is deprecating the FID.
Okay,
Yeah, so out with the FID, in with the INP.
this is so good to know. FID, for those listening, is first input delay.
Yeah. Input meaning,
I
yeah. It's fake, right? An input, it doesn't mean that we're inputting text or data in, right? I kind of like
Yeah,
the interaction more than the
yeah,
input. Input means that I'm actually inputting stuff, into the website.
yeah, yeah. I always thought it was to do with, like, if I type in a form field, is it lagging?
Yeah, yeah, or like
Is
searching and where the results are showing up.
is that not it?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's more of a it's
I'm
more of a
also not
client
sure.
side, right? Yeah, search can
Yeah,
be server side as well.
yeah,
I think this is
yeah,
more how the framework handles, interactions and updates, etc.
yeah. I'm so glad we're getting INP instead of FID. It just makes more sense, especially the way you described it, which is so cool. Okay, so you mentioned LCP, largest contentful paint, which is like just a big piece of content. How long the largest piece of content takes to load, which you ideally want fast, so then people can consume that content. INP, which is, gosh, remind me.
Yeah, in interaction to next paint.
Interaction to next paint. Okay. And then, I mean, there's a whole bunch of others. You speak a lot about CLS, cumulative layout shift. And I absolutely hate this one specifically. Okay. Look, I'm almost getting triggered enough to rant. I'll try and compose myself, but like airline booking websites. Oh my God. Just like, I don't know if it's they don't pay their engineers or they don't care. It's bad. because I go to click on, especially with the nefarious ones like EasyJet or Ryanair, like the budget ones, they're optimized to get your money, right? And so I go to click on next step, the button slightly moves, and it's like,
Mhm.
hey, by the way, do you want to add travel insurance to that? And I said, no, I just want to book my ticket. So layout shift can be weaponized in the case of excessive e-commerce optimization, or it can just be naive, right? You go to click on a button, but a chat message appears, the button moves, and you either misclick and click on nothing, or worst case, you misclick and click on the buy button when you didn't have money to
Yeah.
spend. So CLS can be really diabolical, cumulative layout shift. You did a number of talks about this. Can we understand CLS a little bit more? For example, I'm talking specifically from a performance timestamp sort of perspective. The browser does things like layout and then paint. Can you walk us through these steps? Where does CLS happen exactly?
Yeah. CLS is the reason for the majority of the Hulk smash on your
Yeah,
keyboards.
yeah,
And yeah, it needs to be solved. And it's, as you mentioned, like it's part of the dark patterns in UX. Like it can be weaponized, and that's not cool. We all know that. But yeah, where it happens, when the browser loads a website, right? It gets the main resource, which is the HTML that the server returns, and it starts to parse it, top to bottom, line by line. It's as it does that, it forms the DOM, the document object model, right? It starts forming the DOM. Gets into the head element. It starts to pull all of the resource links, and it triggers out HTTP requests for all of them, right? And these are the render blocking resources, the CSS and JavaScript, right? So it stops. It gets all of the resources. It continues. When it starts to parse the CSS, it builds the CSS OM, which is a CSS object model. And the moment where it goes through the whole main resource, it has the DOM created, it has the CSS OM created. Before it proceeds, it's going to trigger the render blocking JavaScript, and we need to keep that at minimum, only for the rendering of the website, nothing more, because yeah, website is going to load very slow. But as soon as it does that, it goes into the making, like a constructing of the render tree, by using the CSS OM and the DOM. So the render tree is basically contains all of the visible elements. And
Mhm.
think of that as you're browsing a website on your desktop, but the website has like a mobile menu and it's hidden because you're on desktop. That's not going to be part of the render tree, right?
Yeah.
So out of this DOM and CSS OM, we get the render tree. This is what the browser needs to show on the website, right? As soon as it gets that, it gets into the layout phase where it calculates the size and the position of every element on the screen out of the render tree, but then also in correlation with the other elements, like neighbors, etc. This is where the CLS happens.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it goes into painting, right? So we painted layer by layer. We got Z index. There's like multiple layers. Then we go into compositing to composite all the layers in together and then slap the screen, slap the website on the screen. And
Right.
I mentioned the layout phase, right? That's where the CLS happens. For example, if we have an image and we don't explicitly set the width and height to it, neither by HTML or CSS, the browser is going to be like, this is zero, right? This is 0 by 0, so I'm just gonna leave 0 by 0 pixels, but I know that it's there. This is, I know its place. I know it's like above this element and below this element,
Yeah.
but the size is 0 and 0. And if the image is lazy loaded, it's going to be the HTTP request for that is it's gonna happen afterwards, like after the document loads. And then the browser is aware of the size, so it's gonna push everything, a way to make room for the image, and that's the layout shift. You might be reading
Interesting.
the text already, but then it suddenly gets pushed down because there was like a portrait image, and you're not reading anymore, so you lost your line. That is the
Interesting.
layout.
So the thank you for that. That was so clear, like going all the way to how a browser puts a website on the screen. This is often so fast that people don't even notice that so much happens, right? It's absolutely amazing technology. That was such a good explanation. And that makes it so clear the easiest way, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, tell me when I'm done. The easiest way to mitigate against layout shift, or at least one of the easiest ways, is to literally just give your image elements width and height properties.
Yeah,
Is that, yeah, okay.
that's it. It's for the browser to to know how to handle the layouting and sizing.
And let me just say this, I was resistant to doing this for a very long time because of my own ignorance earlier in my career, because I thought, and indeed the web browsers did work this way previously, where
Mhm.
if you specify a width and a height that was not respective to the aspect ratio of the image, then the browser would warp the image. But that's no longer the case, right? The browser maintains the aspect ratio despite the width and height being out of sync, so to speak.
Yeah, so like there's multiple ways, right? For example, we can set the image to be like contain or cover, so that we maintain the placing and sizing of the container of the image. But in case it's like a different aspect ratio, we can like zoom it in and try to stretch it, but do not warp it, right?
Is
That's
that
one
is
way
that
to
done
go
with
around. Sorry?
is that done with HTML attributes, or is that a CSS? How I
CSS.
have not.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
That's the we're talking about the object fit property. So that's one
Yeah,
way to go, right? Now we also have aspect ratio. For
yeah,
example, it didn't exist always. So a responsive way to basically like place images on the site, if you know the aspect ratio, is to, I don't know, set the width to 100%. And this is when we're using the browser's knowledge of the how the image uh you know correlates with other elements on the screen, for example the parent. So if we say 100%, then the parent size is gonna get
yeah.
passed down to the image. But then with the aspect ratio, we can define, I don't know, 16 by 9. So the browser, that is enough info for the browser to say, okay, for example, if I have this much width and this is the aspect ratio, then I can easily calculate the height and we're good, right? We
That's
have
so
the,
cool.
yeah, I don't even like, we don't even need to specify the height. We can just say, here's the width, here's the aspect ratio. You figure it out based on the
That's so
moment where
cool.
the user loads the website, right? We have a ton of devices now.
Yeah, that is so cool. I have a confession to make. I, because of my previous brainwashing of the old web, the way I would get images to fit within a container, either contain or cover, is using background image,
Mhm.
because the CSS property background size supports container cover. And I believe object fit came much later than this. So I've had to like unlearn. So now, even today, like if I'm doing something and I want the image to be responsive and fit within a container, I still go the background image route. Obviously, that there's accessibility problems here for non-decorative images, right? You don't get all text for CSS background images.
Yeah.
But yeah, I need to like actively put an effort to use object fit, because it's not my instinct. It's wild. You mentioned CLS happens at the layout phase. You've also in your talk mentioned that fonts can cause CLS. This is so interesting. Is it because font rendering also happens at the? It probably is, because font rendering also happens at the layout phase. So, for example, if your fallback font is like Segway UI or San Francisco in the case of Mac OS, I don't know if it's still San Francisco, whatever, Apple Pro, whatever it may be. If it's some system font, and then you replace it with like Inter because you're not inspired, uh, that shift of loading the font and rendering it, that does that also then happen at the layout phase? I'd love it if you could spend more time explaining that.
Yeah. So there are different ways where you can load fonts, right? And when there's like two conditions that happen, there's like FOUT, FOUT, and FOIT, FOIT, which stand for like flash of unstyled text and flash of invisible text. So
Interesting.
this is when you load fonts in a different way. For example, if you don't specify either you do or don't specify a fallback font, but if you specify the font display property to be like blocking or any of the other, aside from I think it was like swap, you're basically FOITing, flash of invisible text, because when your website loads, while you're while the browser is downloading the font, there's going to be no text on the website. And as
Wow.
soon as the browser downloads it, that's when it starts to rendering. And that's the font display property. That's how you control how you're going to draw the text on the screen, right? So, for example, usually we're using like Google fonts, etc., and we're like at import in
Yeah.
CSS to load the font. If you like follow that link in Chrome, you're going to see a font face, a number of font face declarations, and inside they have the font display set to swap. And what basically means, what swap stands for is I'm going to use a fallback font while I'm loading the desired font, because it's like it's like an external resource. I need
Yeah.
to trigger an HTTP to pull that into the browser before I start to render it. And then I'm going to swap out the system font with the designer font, let's say, right?
Mm.
And that swapping can actually cause CLS, because websites are content, and we do have images, but there's like text everywhere, right? If the default line height from the fallback font is very different than the designer font or the web font, there's gonna be that layout shift, and
Right.
you're basically pushing on everything that's a text that used the fallback and now it's using the designer will push things around. So that's how CLS happens in fonts, and there are ways you can fix that. Yeah, there's like a few properties where you can play with in order to make the fallback font, even though it's like Apple Pro or whatever it is, to make its size as close to the designer font, because at dev time how that needs to look like, right? There are even
So
tools that can generate all these properties for you, so you don't need to do that by hand.
that's so interesting. Thank you for that explanation of how fonts can cause CLS.
Yeah,
I want to talk about, first of all, let's finish this through the end. I want to talk about some of those tools and some of the techniques we can use to prevent that, because I think that's a huge problem.
yeah.
But also I want to talk about not FOIT but FOUT, flash of unstyled text,
Unstyled text, yeah.
because that also, I mean, even if it doesn't cause CLS, it's ugly. And I wonder if I could poke your brain around ways to mitigate against that. So let's maybe start with just the CLS based on FOUT, and then go to just preventing FOUT altogether.
Yeah,
And you're probably
well,
going to tell me to not request fonts but host them on my own CDN, and then it's going to go away probably. But
exactly.
anyway,
Yeah,
I'll let you talk.
yeah. So FOUT is, if we're picking FOIT or FOUT, we definitely want a FOUT instead of
Yeah.
FOIT. What happens in FOIT is, for example, if your font takes 3 seconds to load, then your users are going to stare at a blank website. There's going to be layout, but no text, so they
Mm.
cannot use the website, right? And we don't want that. The less of two evils is FOUT instead of FOIT, so we're going the FOUT way. And what we can do is to basically, what we should focus on is to minimize the time it takes the browser to load the web font, right? So we can, of course, use CDN, etc. You can host on your own domain so that you can utilize the opened, TCP connection to your server. Although I think now with, was it HTTP 3 or something like that, or 2, I don't know. There was this interesting thing called like, it doesn't matter if the resources are like on your server or a different one. It's weird, but it's like an improvement. It's an improvement. Yeah, it might not be the case for too long. But yeah, utilize the TCP connection that's already opened, because the main
Mm.
resource has been pulled through that connection. That's going to be the font connection as well. Subsetting is also an interesting way to minimize the file size of the font, because if your website is mostly using, for example, like English, and you don't have any other supports for, like, I don't know, Cyrillic languages or
Yeah.
Asian languages, any alphabet other than the Latin one, you can cut out that part from the font file. So, those glyphs, so you'll end up with a much smaller file. So that's basically subsetting.
This sounds like a great open source project idea if it doesn't already exist, right? npm run subset my font. And I mean, since it's all static anyway, it can quickly analyze your source code, go like, okay, you're using all of these glyphs from the font, and then at build time, generate you a new production font as that is tree shaken essentially of glyphs.
Tree
And then you
shaking
just
for
ship
fonts,
that.
yeah.
Is that, do you know if anything exists, or did I just stumble across the next
I'm
great
not
open
sure, but
source project?
it's a cool idea.
Well, there you go. Free idea for anyone who wants to get into open source and knows how to do that. I might do that. But being fully honest, I don't have time between this podcast and all my conferences and books and things. So yes, free idea. That's awesome. So you mentioned you mentioned this. Is it safe to call it a hack? Like this hack of like the fallback font adjusting its sizes such that it perfectly matches the target font or the designer font. How do you do that? So if it's just with CSS rules, you'll say like line height matches that the destination or the designer font line height, etc. But then at some point when they swap, you have to like undo those rules, if I understand correctly. How does
Yeah.
one do that?
Yeah, so for example, when you define a font, you define a font face declaration in CSS, right? You set your family, the source, where it comes, where it's coming from, the weight, the style, all these things. But when you define a fallback font, you define another font face declaration. You're going to use a different font family for the fallback, right? For example, in my website, I'm using IBM Plex serif. So I'm loading that as my designer font or like my web font. But for
Hmm.
my fallback, I'm using Times New Roman because that was the closest to IBM
Yeah.
Plex serif, right? And there are these properties called size adjusts, ascent override, descent override, line gap override. If you ask me what they do, I have no idea. It's about drawing letters and the spacing between the letters, and it's like the whole thing. Yeah. So with these properties, you're actually making your fallback font take up the same space
Yeah.
as your web font. So it's still going to be different, right? There's still going to be FOUT, but at least it's not going to push things around. That's
Yeah.
the CLS fixes in these CSS properties there.
That makes so much more sense to me because okay, so you don't use an actual fallback font directly in this case. You have to declare a font face for it and then separate rules on that font face. And that font face is going to have a distinct name
Yeah,
that is
sure.
not Times New Roman, but it's like my
It's gonna
Times New
be,
Roman.
yeah,
And then you,
IBM
cool.
Plex fallback. Yeah. So when I'm
That,
setting the font, I'm setting IBM Plex, comma IBM Plex fallback, comma all the other fonts
yeah.
that I wanna use as fallback. But
And the IBM Plex fallback is an alias for Times New Roman with some extra configuration.
yeah,
That's
with some
so
extra configs.
cool. In my mind, I thought you were doing some wild, like, hey, when this font is loaded, then switch the CSS, like add a class name. Or I, for some reason, my mind went straight to JavaScript, and like as soon as this font load finishes, then swap out classes. It's so much more elegant. Thank you for explaining that. Let's get back to Sentry and talk about now how Sentry helps fix all this FOIT, FOUC, CLS stuff. I know Sentry does have reporting for CLS because you mentioned it supports everything,
Yeah.
and it supports in terms of performance things that may be taking too long that need your attention, such that you go in, you look 5 minutes, okay, what needs my attention? Fix it 5 minutes in, 5 minutes out. How does Sentry measure CLS? Does it spin up like watchers on elements and get client bounding rect and timers? And I mean, this is just my naive top of mind brain implementation, but I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Yeah, we just get what the browser provides, right? And not every browser reports on CLS too. So some of the, for example, some of the data, I think it was Firefox, if I'm not mistaken, that it does not report CLS or something like that. But yeah, not all web browsers report the same set of web vitals. So some of the data might not have, but the ones that will have will be reported by the browser itself.
I didn't know that. I didn't. So this is news to me. Wow, I love feeling like a noob. That's the whole reason I do this freaking podcast. So browsers have a Web Vitals API. You could do like window.webvitals.cls, and this just automatically
Yeah,
gives you a number.
window.performance, and it gives you like all the performance API stuff. Yeah.
That's wild. You know what you're telling me? You're telling me I could probably build Sentry myself in a weekend. I'm joking. But okay, cool. I didn't know that it was that simple. And then Sentry can probably show you historical CLS probably because every user is sending millions of CLS events and it's like here's your average. It's a problem, which is more beneficial than like one single lighthouse test by one user on a really performant device. Okay, that's so cool.
Yeah, you get the
It's actually
distribution, right? There's gonna be like a bar chart for, let's say you want to look at the CLS data for your landing page because that's where you convert.
mm,
You're gonna see like a bar chart with distribution of the x-axis is going to be the CLS score. The y-axis is going to be like the number of occurrences that Sentry has, received. So you'll see where most of your users are in terms of CLS, right? So you'll have a feeling of whether they're sitting towards 0 or it goes above 0.25 or something like that.
that's so cool. That solves, I feel like, a problem that most startups have. Again, I work predominantly with startups, and the problem of I want to work on this thing, and then someone else saying, "Oh, but why? We have other products to ship," and you go like, "Look at this bar chart.
Yeah.
That's so cool." I wonder if we can talk a little bit about Sentry internals because I'm just fascinated by. So I've done a fair amount of systems design, and Sentry is a giant event ingester. It's a very
Mhm.
hungry boy, isn't it? How does that work? I mean, if you could speak to the architecture of something that ingests so many events from so many sources across so many frameworks and backends and languages at scale,
Yeah.
some conversation around what types of databases are in use. I was in-memory caches and non-relational stores, and yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I can like give you like a top level overview because I can talk more about UI design and Figma than I can talk about system design and infrastructure and these things. But basically, what's happening is we got this thing called Relay. It's built with Rust. We pushed it on the edge, and that's where the events get sent, right? So
Is that so? Sorry to interrupt. Is that different than Relay from Meta? That's this like GraphQL data
yeah,
layer, probably. Okay.
yeah. This is
Is
like our
is
own Relay thingy,
is it
event
is it
processor.
open
Yeah,
source?
it is. Yeah, everything's open source.
Okay.
And yeah, we built this in Rust because we need the performance, we need the speed, in this area. So this is where events get processed and they're sent through queues, and the queues, they get like that data gets worked on by workers. I'm not sure, the technology behind those workers, but basically everything ends up either in ClickHouse as a database or in traditional PostgreDB. So that's,
Okay.
yeah,
So it's this is so great that you share this because so ClickHouse for those listening is a non-relational store as far as I know.
yeah,
It was from
it's like a
I
column
believe
database. Yeah,
it came from Yandex, right? If I remember correctly, which is sort of a controversial topic these days. But
yeah, but it's open source, right? Yeah,
but yeah, so you have non-relational stores, you have relational stores, and this is I think that alone is such a good thing for most listeners to know because I can't tell you how many times I go to like a front end, like a React Advanced London or something, and people are going, "Hey, I need to choose a database. Which one should I choose?" And oftentimes the conversation is like, "Do I go with something relational or non-relational? Do I go with maybe in an extreme case, do I go with like planet scale or superbase or something like this?
Yeah.
But there tends to be often the orism, like non-relational or relational. And I'm like, no, no, you need both. You always need
Yeah.
both. And sometimes you need, for really tiny projects, you maybe even need neither, the whole local first movement and storing things in RAM and local
Hmm.
SQLite databases. So I think the fact that you're mentioning here that you need multiple at Sentry is so useful. I'm curious to know if you're able to share what the Postgres is used for and what the non-relational store is used for. And again, feel free to say, hey, I'm not comfortable here. And
If I don't have like an official answer, but logically, right, speaking, ClickHouse is like a column database, so any time series data makes sense to leave there.
which
But any
are just
other
all
type,
events.
all events,
Yeah.
anything that is like associated with a point in time is is stored in ClickHouse. That's why column databases are good for. But
Yeah.
then everything else, like your projects, the team members, traces, maybe because they're not, they could also live in Postgres because they're not time frame. They're like they just exist, and
Yeah.
events point to that. But yeah, these are the two like types of databases that we use. We actually
Mm.
all have the whole architecture open source. Like if you Google
What?
Sentry architecture diagram, you're gonna stumble on a Sentry.dev website. That's the different one. That's not the .io. .io is the product. .dev is the documentation for integration developers, those who want to build an integration with Sentry. So there's a page for the whole infrastructure and the whole architecture of how Sentry is built.
Right.
Yeah.
Crazy. I didn't realize this entire company was so public. Do you have any secrets? Can you share one with me? I'm just joking. That's that's wild. I'm truly fascinated as to how much openness and information symmetry there is. So, okay, you mentioned there's this thing called Relay built in Rust deployed to the edge. And then there's ClickHouse, which is also a distributed database. I'm assuming there's some type of sharding with the relational database, the Postgres as well. With distributed systems, you walk into eventual consistency always. I mean, that comes with territory. What are some problems that Sentry either has to deal with today or had to deal with as it was growing, monitoring so many applications across so many users? I assume a lot of them are like sort of read after write type distributed systems problems, but I'm curious if there are any that stand out that you can speak to.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't. I think that's like more in the ingest folks that work on the ingest type. So I'm so far away from all those
Yeah,
things in the
I can
company.
imagine. This is actually the hard thing I feel like with engineering, right? Because the context is so broad,
Mhm.
and for us, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners can empathize. Like we need to pick at what point of the broad spectrum do we go deep. And as much as I wish we could go deep everywhere. Yeah, I fully understand that there's some
Yeah.
things that we can't.
Like for example, our status page, right? Status.sentry.io
Yeah,
gives you like an overview of the Sentry system at the time. And like if you scroll down, it's not just like red and green, but like lower in the page, we also have the averages of how much like time it took to ingest events and process events, etc. So there are spikes, happening, and but
yeah,
yeah, basically that's the number. That number is the time between an error happening and you being notified
right,
about it.
right. Which I'm assuming is super low. Okay, we're almost at the end. I do want to ask you just some really fun questions. I think
Yeah.
just for my curiosity, and I think the listeners' curiosity as well. How much of, let's put it another way, does Sentry, as a Sentry engineer, use Sentry? Do y'all have some type of like Sentry on Sentry type of thing? I assume it would be super valuable to eat your own dog food. I'm curious if that's the case, and if yes, how much?
A lot. I would say the whole thing is, yeah.
That's
We're
so
big on
cool.
dog fooding. It's it's a religion. So we even talk about it a lot in our blog under the Dog Fooding Chronicles tag. So if you go
That's a
to
C.
blog.sentry.io and type in like Dog Fooding Chronicles, you're gonna see a blog post, a series of blog posts called Dog Fooding Chronicles. But if you click on the tag, like the category in the blog post, you'll see like the whole Dog Fooding Chronicles category. And
What?
yeah, it's basically
Okay,
engineers blogging, talking about how they used Sentry to fix and improve Sentry.
we should. We'll definitely put that in the show notes. I didn't know that existed. That's amazing. That is so cool. I wonder if y'all should like publish that some. I mean, you probably do on social media X or something, but that's incredible. I wish more companies would do that.
Yeah.
Finally, so we've been talking about Sentry a lot. I've learned, frankly, a lot about Sentry from tracing to this this many children thing that shows me at a glance how close to my users or not errors are. We talked about tracing. We talked about Sentry helping with CLS and so on. I assume there may be some interest in Sentry after this, or at least I would hope so. In case everybody decides to go add Sentry to everything, would you caution that? Like, are there some use cases where it may serve developers to just leave it off? For example, proofs of concept that are not going to see any reasonable volume for powerful time series data decisions. Would you suggest starting with Sentry and leaving Sentry on those tiny hobby projects or not?
Well, I would say just like use it everywhere there's an internet connection and you want to pull, valuable insights from how your users are using your app. That means, yeah, if you go into production and you want to be informed by how users are using your app and like what's important to fix now or what's important to fix later, especially if you're an early stage startup, Sentry, definitely install it. Yeah.
Awesome. And then final question: what is the maybe one, maybe more? What is the or are the best practices that you keep having? I mean, in DevRel, you're probably on the front lines, and there's people coming to you with like, "Hey, I can't get this working. Hey, I'm check out my code. My integration is something wrong." You've probably gleaned some best practices from here. You've seen some common issues in the way people use Sentry. Is there something you want to address, maybe en masse? I can't guarantee huge listenership, but some salient sort of regression from best practices or salient best practices that you want to highlight.
Yeah. So I would say like use Sentry to report you and like provide you with the insights that you care about.
Hmm.
Especially, I've seen a lot of use cases where like users are getting bombarded with errors caused by other, like extensions, Chrome extensions and stuff, and you don't care about that. So like take time to go through them and like don't just ignore them, but like just don't just delete them, just like put them in the ignore lists in Sentry so the SDK does not report that to you. That's one thing. And when it comes to, for example, when it comes to performance monitoring and instrumentation, I think there's a balance. Like you can overdo it.
Hmm.
Basically, it's tempting to instrument everything, even your ifs and fors and whiles and whatnot. But if that is vital to the operation flow of your app, then instrument it. If not, just don't do it, because like you can easily overdo it. I've seen people overdo instrumentation, and it's important to realize that that also adds a tiny performance overhead, because that is another code that you write and execute. So the computer will take some time to execute the instrumentation code as well that you put into. So it's very easy to overdo it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. In pursuit of better performance, we actually make it worse.
Yeah.
I can share with you. Yeah, that first thing you said really hit hard for me, like adding useless information to the ignore list, because I often stopped paying attention to my Sentry projects because of exactly that. I was not careful to ignore the right things, and then I keep to this day I keep getting useless errors about things that I don't care about, and it's so bad to the point where I'm like I don't even care anymore. And so something could happen, some production tier 1 service could go down, and I'm like, yeah, it's just Sentry being noisy, whatever. And yeah, I've seen the pain there. Is there some way? Does Sentry have like AI to recognize things that are maybe not so important and suggest to the developer, hey, maybe ignore this one?
Not sure. Like right now, we do have some AI in our product, and there's like a little AI buddy that helps you solve errors. Like
Clippy.
something like Clippy. Yeah, when an error happens, you can scroll down and there's like a little button. Do you want me to try and figure out why this is happening to you? It works most of the cases. Yeah, it's pretty cool. But I'm not sure if we like. I can see the opportunity, to expand the AI and say like this is probably from a
Chrome
this is
extension.
probably from a Chrome extension. So why don't you just add this line in this config file and you'll be good.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd certainly use it. And I know a bunch of engineers would. Anyway, without taking too much of your time, listen, Lazar, it's been so good having you sort of show up and talk about Sentry in all this detail. Look, honestly, I asked questions that I was curious about, and you've done more than deliver enough to satisfy my curiosity and then more. Thank you for putting up with my silly
I'm
questions and
glad.
really just being up for a good chat and offering your huge wealth of information. I really, really appreciate having you on here. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Tejas. Yeah.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Lazar Nikolov. I hope you learned as much from it as I did, and I hope you go forward and make incredible websites and fast, pleasant, joyful experiences on the web. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you to let us know in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something like this, I'd really invite you to leave up to a 5-star review. It really does help. Um, if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, feel free to find me on X. That's at Tejas, TEJS, Kumar _. And I'd love to get in touch with you. Um, this has been so, so pleasing, and I can't wait to share more interesting episodes with some great guests with you. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and thank you for your interest in engineering.